There have always been ways in which we try to understand history through contemporary analysis, in which we often see the manifestation of historical materialist theories with Marxist undertones and the like. Today, we will examine the essay by Marcus Cunningham, Political Metastability, which seeks to conceptualize a new materialist theory of history and especially of political systems. Metastability, a term used by the philosopher Gilbert Simondon, is fundamentally an ontological notion of a specific type of being, one which surpasses the notion of stability and instability. It is a type of being, or a category of being, which is prior to phases or change. Metastability is in a sense the precondition for stability and instability. To quote Marcus, when an equilibrium is broken, in order to ensure the continuity of dynamism and movement of a transformation is required. And for this to be possible, a system must possess the real capacity for structural transformation, metastability, which points to a far more complex nature of the world. The absolute individual is completely undermined because it is never without relation, it is instead a system of individuation. He also states, quote, "Pre-individual beings thus possess none of the normal characteristics we associate with matter. It is a multiplicity of potential which resolves itself into the distribution of singularities, which are disparate potential resolutions for the problematic environment every system of individuation finds itself within and must respond to. Each system of individuation must produce negentropy, reverse entropy, via a metastable movement towards new equilibria. The classic example of this given by Simondon is that a salt crystal is an amorphous phase will always tend towards that structure which has the minimum possible bonding energy, which is a cubic form. This is a cute example, but there are far more complex morphogenetic processes out there like weather systems, stars, rivers, embryogenesis, psychic individuation, etc. And you will need different language to describe them, but in every case, you need metastability. When it comes to analogies with political systems, it will be maintained that they are in fact dynamical systems, but clearly it is more intuitive to think of them in analogy with species being conceived of as adaptive systems. So, pre-individual being is not matter, it is potency which becomes actualized and is a sort of reversed entropy, which is the slowing down of that which is moving. The individual is always undergoing change, as the individual is not seen as an ontology that exists in an atomized disposition. Rather, it exists in a web of potentiality with other individuated entities that also undergo the same process. The notion of an absolute state of affairs within a material system is null, as there are only periodic moments of perceived absoluteness, which is undermined by the system adapting to a new set of potentials that it is intertwined within. To quote Marcus once again, he states, "The individual is the result of processes of individuation, and is always still undergoing individuation. It never exhausts pre-individual beings. This metastability is what gives the individual the ability to adapt and change to new circumstances, specifically adopting new structures in response to new development. In other words, when an entity or system comes across external pressures, it needs to adapt, or it will die as a structure. But something does die as it develops its past identity, which dies." This metaphysical thesis can be applied to politics because, like natural phenomena, politics too is a system and one with many complexities. We can thus understand political structures in history by using the ontological notion of metastability. Political systems, such as states, in order to maintain their power and sovereignty, must find ways in which they can impose order upon their own population, and also impose order against potential external threats to their sovereignty. This fact alone already demonstrates the notion of an individual, in this case the state, being entwined within a multitude of potentiality, such as the state of affairs outside its domain of power and inside. Marcus gives the example, quote, "There are a number of important developments to note throughout the Middle Ages, such as the emergence of permanent capital cities, the introduction of mass coinage, and later the printing press, and of course the introduction of gunpowder and modern mass warfare. Coinage allowed for non-local economic relations, and literacy allowed for mass communication, which both enabled the rise of the modern state and the subordination of intermediaries. Gunpowder also removed to a large extent the qualitative nature of war and made mobilizing mass numbers of men and the industrial production of weapons and other relevant military equipment for the most decisive factor. Modernizing reforms were introduced in a top-down fashion in refutation of common assumptions informed by liberal ideology. The adoption of these innovations by one state ahead of others gives that state a comparative advantage geopolitically, and so the innovation is forced on other states, which now require structural reform in order to keep up." End quote. Political structures change, one can say, qualitatively, in the sense that their internal design changes and so does their mode of acting as the state of affairs around them causes them to change, much like the notion of natural selection. Although there is constant variation internally and in action, the structure of power remains the same and is in this sense metastable. The French political philosopher Bertrand de Juvenal is someone who is concerned with the nature of power, and also with how the change of power occurs, and through what methodology those in power use to try and secure their status as powerful. He cites Bertrand de Juvenal as someone who recognizes this phenomenon, where institutions are transformed by their external neighbors, and this is shown in de Juvenal's notion of the high/middle versus low. Quote, "And so we see a basic duality with power, a social and expansionist nature, which is possessed both by central and intermediary institutions. The sovereign institutions, which in modernity is the state, has the binary choice of cooperation or sabotage with its intermediaries, and vice versa. Society is an amalgamation of institutions which all possess the duality of having the basic incentive to perform their basic social function. For example, of a corporation to deliver a product or service, but also the incentive to dominate their market and increase their own power. The complexity can increase infinitely, since sovereign institutionality could side with some intermediaries against others, with the nobility against the church, with the high nobility against the low nobility, or the opposite, etc. This means that the sovereign institution is always maintaining a balance of a coalition which is composed of different institutions represented by ethnicities, religious authorities, familial or tribal authorities, nobility, corporations, regional authorities, and so on. Power is thus not simple but composed of coalitions, which at any one moment uphold a given order. They are not necessarily stable, and there will be gradual temporal shifts in power balances depending on any number of contingent factors imaginable. There will always be different degrees of sabotage and cooperation among the different parts of the coalition, and this will also determine how things play out." End quote. He talks about the nature of revolutions being indications of a phase change from a maladaptive state to an adaptive state. He says, quote, "The typical narrative around revolution is that it is against tyranny, when in fact there is an extraordinary increase in state power after a revolution, and all the famous tyrants of monarchical history seem to get off without much trouble. Revolutions under our model are the result of a failure of the state. The state is incapable of structural reform in light of competition with other states, which can be for a number of reasons, and so a movement to a new equilibrium is necessary. A phase change, a bifurcation. If the metastability of a particular ruling institutional configuration is insufficient to adapt to a geopolitical problem, then it will be destroyed and replaced by one which will, in a great event, if the metastability of the sovereign institution is greater, then a revolution will be unnecessary." He goes on to speak about how the state competes with economic classes, but also how this sometimes can support certain economic classes, but this support is not inevitable like other historical materialists tend to think, such as the Marxists, who claim that the state's sole purpose is to guarantee the sovereignty of the wealthy classes. The issue here is that they do not understand the nature of the state. The state exists to maintain order and compete against other states which threaten this order, and sometimes aligning with certain economic classes is the best way to do this. In terms of drawing an analogical link between the evolutionary process of adaptive change and structural change, we must also add that the states that remain the same for extended periods of time must have not undergone that much selection pressure. For instance, in animal species that are the same as they always were, there must have not been too much selection pressure from the exterior. This must also be the case for political systems. Systems and states with abundant resources and territory can often not be as strong and adapted as states with fewer resources, but with a better knowledge of how to use them, thus making them stronger geopolitically. It must also be noted that a state simply having access to abundant resources does not by default make them more adapted. It is those who know how to use their resources and how to change the nature of governance when necessary that are more well adapted. Thus, we can understand his history as well as the concept of metastability and especially de Juvenal's power dynamic. In reference to England, the embracement of Protestant ideology was used as a means to implement absolutism, which is to say, the ideology was used by England to expand its power and break with the authority of the Catholic Church in order to have complete domain over England. Russia is also a perfect example of a state where one can understand the concept of metastability. As due to its failure to adapt to internal pressures as well as external pressures, the Tsarist regime had to be negated and replaced with something that would allow it to advance and advance quickly in order for the geographical region of Russia to remain sovereign in some sense. States, in order to delay their decay and demise, can often implement measures to sustain themselves, such as the Stolypin reforms in the case of Tsarist Russia. Ultimately, though, any reforms that are not large and encompassing all the issues within a system can only slow down the process of death. Marcus states, quote, "The metastable dynamism of the Russian regime certainly prevented a revolution in the 19th century. This is in stark contrast to pre-revolutionary France and China, where the entrenchment of economic elites with sovereign institutionality prevented these exact sort of reforms taking place and precipitated revolution. 19th century Russia was, however, capable of structural reform and improving their situation without such drastic means. This runs counter to the Marxist analysis because the reforms were primarily motivated by internal security of the sovereign institution in response to external security threats. Politics is the more fundamental problem faced by society, and domination over geographic area supervenes over the interest of a dominant economic class. The state can and does go directly against their interest in this and many other cases. After the destruction of the Tsarist regime, you had an intense centralization of state power, and this was due to the need to mass industrialize, and the invasions of the satellite states was the manifestation of a long-term geopolitical goal of Russia, and they now had the ability to pursue this. The realization of this whole process really puts a coffin in the Marxist historical materialism, as we can see as states mature and develop, they become more concerned with security more than anything else. Russia, in order to compete with the rest of the world, tragically had to take on an era of communism in order to secure themselves as a world power. To conclude, I will quote the text one last time. Quote, "There is no final solution to history. There is no utopia. What Mearsheimer called the tragedy of great power politics presents us with a brutal world that rewards power for its own sake. To quote Juvenal, quote, 'The state is the repository of men's dreams, and it is where they go to die,' unquote. This tragic view must oppose utopian ideological visions of the state's role in history. Order is fleeting and rare. Entropy is far more endemic than negentropy. From this perspective, politics is about the balancing of internal coalitions and interests, bending the will of would-be saboteurs to the greater cause of surviving security competition with the opposing powers. This political negentropy is impossible to secure permanently. A permanent equilibrium is impossible. Real order in a society is metastability. A dynamic society is capable of constant structural reform in response to shifts out of equilibrium as new situations develop. Society is not a closed system, but constantly in interaction with shifts in the natural world. Power balances at home and abroad are always shifting, and man is a sick animal. There is no permanent solution. Metastability is only possible when you have a leadership willing and able to be pioneering, which thrusts it into the unknown, which confronts problems and creates new precedents in the state of exception. The eternal return of the metastable, due to the constant shifts in disequilibrium, is actually what makes life possible in the first place. Without struggle and conflict, there would be no life. But in my view, a life without struggle is not worth living at all. Real equilibrium is death. The only truly stable form is static, equally spread out energy, heat death. Life itself is not the striving to this form, it is the struggle against it. So of course there is no permanent solution, and ideologies which promise an end to history ultimately promise a pathetic and unsurprising vision. The struggle for order is therefore meaningful because it is an extension of the struggle of life. Political nihilism is the result of the idealism of the playing to win forever and establish a utopia. All real victories are secured by people who are playing to play. Affirming struggle is the only way to engage with an actual political reality as meaningful in itself. All else is cope and denial.